Hello, today we are in part two of our investigation of the Inca Empire. As you remember, the last lecture focused on the roads, infrastructure, and really the heightening of the landscape under the rule of the Sapa Inca. Today we're going to take that a little bit farther and look at larger architectural and agricultural sites that really show us what the Inca were up to at the height of their prowess, at the height of their construction skills, just before Spain arrived to colonize them and really destroy most of the population through disease. So we're getting a glimpse of a truly magnificent empire, one whose royal sites rival those of Versailles just before its fall. Okay, let's think about where we are. While we looked at some small, discrete huacas in the landscape that really brought the presence of the ruling Inca, the Sapa Inca, to mind for travelers on those Incan roads, what we're looking at today is a heightened monumentality. We're looking at a series of striking examples of terracing in the Inca territory, and we are looking at sites that are still, their use, their purpose is still debated. Moray, that we'll take a look at now, is one of those. What you're seeing is a map of the region. You can see that dry pinkish color over to the right and near the top of the map. Then toward the left, we're getting into higher hills headed up into the Andes Mountains where things become a lot more green. Moray is highly notable for its circular terracing. Let's look at that in a little detail. What we're looking at is a series of circular terraced surfaces with sunken plazas at the bottom. We've seen sunken circular plazas throughout the class at particularly ceremonial sites. So that's something to really keep in mind as we try to understand what this site is about. The purpose of Moray is still under debate. There are two strong schools of thought, both with substantial evidence to support their claims. Using what you've learned in the class so far, think through what we're looking at. And I'd love to hear what you think this site was most likely used for as we get into it in a minute. So as you can see here, we have a series of concentric circles topographically that point to the places where the Inca have, again, really refined the contour of the land as they found it. This could be for two purposes. You can see here that there are about 7 different platforms, plazas, and circular terracing locations. The bottom of this that area where the sunken plaza is located, that's called a muyu, M-U-Y-U, and that simply means the bottom of the concentric terrace. So as architectural investigators, architectural historians, the first thing we want to take note of here is the height, the scale, the relationship to the landscape. So right off the bat, we know that this site is about 9 stories in difference from the height of the tallest concentric circle of what we're looking at here to that bottom muyu. We also know that over those 9 stories, over those 90 meters in fact, there was a 15-degree temperature change from the top to the bottom. So what does that bring to mind? Why create a site with a temperature change like that? One of the main speculations for how the site was used is how we would think about it now. When you see a terraced hillside now, we kind of intuitively imagine it's for agricultural purposes. One strong theory is that this was an experimental agriculture station for the Inca. I'm fascinated by this idea. Following this train of thought, each different layer would have been used to test out different types of seeds, different types of plants, and to figure out at which altitude, at which temperature they grew best. It's a fascinating idea. It's one that aligns with very current modern agricultural modes of investigation. There's a little problem with that theory, however. In order for these terraces to be successful, plants, as we know, need two things at their most basic, right? They need sunshine and water. And it's the water, it's the hydraulics of this site that both raise the possibility of agricultural experimentation and crush it. We know that these were traveled by foot. We have these beautiful embedded cantilevered stones that function as staircases between each terrace layer. It's not unlike a giant version of the puquillos, right? Where circulation, circumambulation might be part of the process. But we're not gathering water from the bottom. There isn't an aquifer below here. Instead, what we have is this really brilliant way of using hydrology, using the manipulation of water across space to either irrigate the site or to make it more spectacular for ceremonial purposes. And we have these two competing visions, right? We have the sunken circular plazas that we've seen as early as Chavin that are for ceremonial, religious, sometimes even drug-induced ecstatic practices. And then on the other hand, as you can see in this image, you have Dr. Wright here, who did some of this early investigative work into the hydrology of the site on the left. And then on the right, you have a series of examples, and these are taken from the terraces themselves. So you can see the correspondence between what's happening on the left and what's being shown on the right. These are illustrations of how the stones were carved beautifully and precisely to create these long funnels, these long runoff spouts, where the water would travel down from the top from one terrace to the next to the next. That seems to point to agriculture in some way, but the fault with that theory is that actually the platforms were not irrigated. The water ran in these smooth canals, which would have lined up with sunken, dug spaces in what now looks like grass on the terraces. And that water just moved straight down the hill into the muyu, the sunken courtyard at the bottom. We know it was funneled there intentionally because archaeological digs of the site show us this section. We can see how the water was moved down to the muyu where it met with topsoil. It leached through the topsoil down into the sand intentionally planted or located there, engineered on purpose. It wasn't just this way when they found it. And then a series of cobblestones and gravel below that, larger andesite boulders, and even that below that, larger rocks, all designed to funnel water out of that space down into the earth below. That doesn't look agricultural. Instead, what we might be seeing is another sunken ceremonial structure here for a much larger population who may have been circulating across each level of the terrace. Each terrace might have served a particular social class. We know the Inca were highly stratified. We're still on the cusp of understanding exactly what this site was used for. But by looking at the hydrology, really studying what the water is doing and how it is made to move through the site, we have a little stronger understanding that this was most likely ceremonial and not an agricultural testing ground. About the intentionality of the site, we have a series of huacas that sit around these terraces. Two in particular point us to the engineering skill and planning of the Inca in creating moray. You can see here on the left is one of the huacas, one large rock, and on the right you see its diagram. On the top left of the stone, there are a series of indentures that are concave that note 8 springs that were in the area. The reservoirs are also drawn out, as well as canal crossings. It's a way that the engineers spoke to one another, spoke to the laborers on the site. It is like a blueprint in a sense, just carved in stone, a thing that the Inca were incredibly skilled in working with. Here's a closer image of one of those huacas where you can see the way that those 8 springs in the region were carved out here in these small concave spaces on the left. We'll look at the use of this planning and engineering in the next section. So that closes out this first bit of the lecture. Take a break, walk around, and come back and watch the second part in a minute.